We are about to start probably the most important part of the day, so the scope of the competition. I would like to welcome everyone that's joining us online, and sorry for the short delay. The first presenter is going to be Richard Morris, who is going to talk about the scope of the CAV R&D competition. Thank you.
Thanks, George. Okay, so you've heard all the interesting bits surrounding the competition, so now we get to the meat of it. So I hope that in addition to going through the detail of the scope, we can try and iron out perhaps some of the doubts or queries, and any that we don't, and then we'll take in the question session afterwards. Okay, so what I'm going to talk about, this is the presentation. So I'm going to go through what the competition is, the eligibility and the magnitudes of the project, the funding levels which will be available, the scope, what do we actually want you to do, and obviously what is not in scope, just try and clarify some of those issues, and dates and timings at the end. So I think this slide actually encapsulates pretty much what Simon Shapcott was talking about this morning. So basically CCAV are looking to invest £25 million in industry-led projects to develop and then pilot connected autonomous vehicle services at scale in a UK setting. And this is purely for collaborative research and development projects, and we're expecting to fund between 2 and 4 large, high-quality projects that can demonstrate the UK's capabilities to a global audience. So that's, in effect, that's 2 streams. One is we can demonstrate it to UK public. These things are safe, these are good things to have. And we're also demonstrating to the world automotive environment to say, come and develop your vehicles here. We're looking for pilot studies to develop and test connected and autonomous vehicles. And one thing I'd like to make clear here is, what do we mean by CAV in this context? Depending on who reads and how you interpret it, it can mean connected, autonomous, or connected and autonomous. In this context, we're just talking about autonomous and connected and autonomous. We're not looking at connected vehicles without autonomy. So we're looking for these to be deployed in a real-world public or semi-controlled environment with at least a 6-month public trial, ideally up to 12. And we're looking for ambitious proposals where the commercial benefit is very strong and there's a clear route to commercial operation after the project. The projects need to be focused on developing SE Level 4 automation or above. Now, SE Level 4 means basically the technology will be okay for some environments, but not all. This is why we're expecting you to be using the vehicles in relatively constrained environments. Those constrained environments may be geofenced, they may be public or non-public. It may be that they are only highways, or only rural, or only urban. So because they're constrained, they are likely to be level 4. If you think you can do a level 5, great. You don't have to, though. Moving on to the next bullet point, all projects must be collaborative, business-led, and conduct their research and development in the UK. So I think that's probably not news to anybody. And if your project costs or your duration fall outside the eligibility criteria, come and talk to us. If your scope's outside, don't bother. But if your timing or your costs are outside, but only just outside, come and talk to us. So in terms of eligibility, as I said, we've got 25 million up for grabs. Simon's obviously got very deep pockets. We're expecting to fund 2 to 4 projects, and these can range in size from 5 to 20 million total eligible project costs. So we're expecting the projects to last between 18 and 30 months, but they must be completed by 31st of March 2022. That's a hard deadline, which we can't slip. To lead a project, you must be UK-based, you must be UK-based business, and you have to do the work in the UK. And you have to work in collaboration with others. If you want to collaborate but not lead, you can be a business of any size, or you can be a research organisation or an academic organisation. But if you are effectively a 100% funded partner, i.e. research or academic, then you are limited to 30% of the total eligible project costs. And if there are multiple, then it's 30% across all such 100% funded partners. You have to shout out between you. In terms of funding levels, we've talked about industrial research. If you're doing industrial research, then the funding levels are 70% if you're a small or micro, 60% if you're medium, 50% if you're large. Obviously, this is on the business side. If you are straying into the territory of experimental development, then the funding levels are lower. They're only 45% for small and micro, 35% for medium, 25% for large businesses. So those are for projects which are closer to, or higher TRL levels and closer to full operation. So what I would say is, if you're not sure where you are you experimental development or are you industrial research, go take a look in the, brain's gone dead. If you take a look at the state aid manual, and you can do a search on the state aid manual, you'll find it. You can download a PDF, and it will explain what the differences are. I believe it's on page 39. So go and have a look. And if that doesn't make it any clearer, then I'd strongly recommend that you get independent legal advice as to whether there will be a state aid problem with what you're suggesting if you're expecting to get the higher funding level. So if in doubt, go and find out. Please don't come and talk to us, because we are not experts in state aid, and you can get expert advice in the marketplace from those who profess to know more about it than we do. So if in doubt, ask them. But at least go and have a look at the state aid manual first. Moving on to the scope. As Simon said, we're looking for projects which pilot CAV services at scale in the UK or in a UK setting. We're looking for high quality proposals that demonstrate the capabilities and technologies to a global audience. Effectively, we're asking for three things: demonstrations or tested and validation of the technologies. But in this competition, that's less of a focus. That has been the focus in previous competitions. In this one, it's less of a focus, but it can still be there. More in focus is whether the public will accept them. And the third point, developing the business models to develop sustainable services. So we said your project must focus on viable business opportunities and operating model. And the aim is to develop capabilities which can introduce services by 2020 and stay in use, that's be commercially viable, for a significant period of time. Vehicles should be appropriate to the situation they're used in. So if you want to use M1 vehicles on the roads, that's great. M2 buses, that's fine. If you want to use pods or vehicles which are not road legal, then you're going to have to constrain them. We're not saying what you have to use. You have to make sure, you have to demonstrate that the vehicles you want to use are appropriate for the service that you want to offer. We've said here that the projects and trials can either be in urban, interurban, or rural settings, or any combination of those. What you must include is some social behavioural research aspects to learn about how the public can accept CAVs. So this research must be applied to the development of your service model. In other words, is it going to be acceptable? Is it going to be viable because it's acceptable? So your service model should improve the efficiency of journeys in terms of times and costs. You have to prove to people that these are actually a good idea. Why do you want CAVs? Because they're better than the alternative. So you actually have to show that they're better. They are either quicker in terms of getting from point A to point B, or they're cheaper, or preferably both. You must explain how it will benefit the users, the communities, and where appropriate, link to other modes of transportation. But the emphasis is not on the other modes of transportation, the emphasis is on the CAVs. Your project team must include the organisations you need to develop and to scale up the technologies and the business model to give the delivery of the service. So what we're not looking for is somebody developing one or two vehicles showing, yes, it all works, doing a little demo somewhere, and at the end of the project, walk away. We need to have sufficient participation to say, yes, we can scale this up. This service is going to grow, the product's going to grow, whatever it is going to grow, and it's going to make money. Continuing the scope, we're also saying that the project must include a trial of at least 6 months, preferably 12. If you only go above 12, we're not going to complain. It has to be at scale, and we're expecting it in a semi-controlled or public environment. We're expecting to support the development of solutions for SAE Level 4 and above, and we're expecting to produce a final report and a dissemination plan. And key in that final report will be what is the business case for the future and how are the public likely to accept it. Obviously, the projects must be safe and dependable. That pretty much goes without saying, but we're going to say it anyway because it is important. And we have to show a clear, or you need to show a clear route to market and detail how you are going to exploit the results of the project, including the viable business model. We expect what you find out you will share with other projects by taking part in the cohort groups which we have, which Innovate UK runs with the help of KTN every 6 months. And in fact, the next one, I think, is on the 11th of July for those who are already participating in projects. But we would expect you to participate in every 6 months or thereabouts. And we may adopt a portfolio approach to this competition. What do we mean by that? Well, if we happen to get 2 projects which are pretty much identical and another project which is different but equally good, then we will select the ones which are different to give us a spread. So we're not looking to do duplicate projects. Depends on the quality, of course, depends what comes in. We don't know that yet. I'm sure you're still thinking about what you want to do. But fundamentally, we reserve the right to take a portfolio approach. So what's out of scope? Well, anything that doesn't meet the scope of the competition, obviously. But it must specifically, we're looking at the demonstration and trials. So if it doesn't do a demonstration or a trial, then it's out of scope. We're not looking at other modes of transport except on the peripheries of the project. So fundamentally, we're looking at CAV vehicles, connected autonomous vehicles, not trains or trams or aeroplanes. And if you require some infrastructure or supporting systems, you can include them, but they cannot be the primary cost. And you need to make a good case as to why you want to have those particular facilities. In terms of the dates and timings, well, the briefing events are down the left-hand side, and unfortunately I haven't crossed out the Belfast one, which is not going ahead. And obviously we all know we're in London. On the right-hand side are probably the key dates. First of all, the application date, it closes at midday on the 19th of September. And if you are successful, you'll be, in terms of your written application, you'll be invited to interview week beginning the 12th of October. You'll get feedback very shortly afterwards, we hope, so about the 15th of October. And, oh, sorry, beg your pardon, that's wrong, isn't it? Invitation to interview feedback to interview applicants. Oh, sorry, the first one, the 15th of October one is the feedback to interview applicants who have been successful in terms of their written application. Sorry, that's what wasn't clear. The actual interviews are 5th to the 8th of November, and we'll tell you whether you've been successful on the 30th or thereabouts. Ministerials allowing us to announce. So, I think that's the bulk of the scope. So, thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Richard. If you have any questions for Richard, please just take a note of them. He's going to be a part of the Q&A panel. For the people watching live, my colleague Monica will take your questions and ask them during the Q&A, so please just type them. In the meantime, I would like to invite Joe and Melissa to talk about the application process for the competition. Thank you.
Okay, so good afternoon, everybody. So my name is Melissa Hughes. I'm a Portfolio Manager at Innovate UK, and I'm joined today by Joe. And between us, we're going to take you through the application process, including eligibility criteria, finances, submitting your application, what happens after you've submitted your application, and then a brief overview of project setup for successful applicants. And then at the end, we have a Q&A session for both competition process and also scope. So just to recap on the eligibility criteria for this competition, so the lead needs to be a UK-based business, and all applications submitted into this competition must be collaborative. Project costs can vary between 5 to 20 million, and duration can be between 18 to 30 months. This competition is held on our online platform, the Innovation Funding Service, IFS, and it's using our 10 standard questions with appendices for questions 2, 3, 7, and 8. So here's just a list of the types of organisations we fund here at Innovate UK. So we've got businesses in a range of sizes, research organisations including universities and public sector research establishments, and also charities and public sector organisations. So participation rules for this competition. So 70% of total eligible project costs must be incurred by a business, and the maximum level of costs for research organisation is capped at 30%. So if you have more than one research organisation within your proposal, they will share this 30% between them. So as mentioned, all proposals in this competition must be collaborative. So what do we mean by collaboration? So there needs to be at least 2 organisations within your proposal that are claiming grant, and this includes the lead organisation. And we would expect to see evidence of a genuine collaboration within your proposal. If you have submitted an application into previous Innovate UK competitions, as the lead or the sole company and you were awarded funding, but you didn't make a substantial effort to exploit that award, then we will award no more funding to you. So just bear this in mind. So there was some discrepancies between the dates. These dates are the correct dates, and these are what are on IFS if you check online. So interviews are actually between the 29th of October to the 1st of November. And the submission deadline for this competition is noon on the 19th of September. And if you are invited to interview, you'll be told on the 5th of October, with all applicants informed of the final decision by the 30th of November. So I'll now run you through the process. So as I mentioned, this competition is on IFS. So this is just a diagram of the countries and users that we have, and as you can see, predominantly it's within the UK. So for this competition, you just need to go on the Innovate UK website and click on or you can search and click onto that, and you'll find all the information you need. So all the information that Joe and I are presenting today, and also all scope information, is available for you on the website. So for creating an application, simply sign in if you've previously used IFS before, or create an account if you're new to IFS. For research organisations and universities, we do recommend that you type your information in manually as opposed to using Companies House to ensure that you're listed as a university rather than a business. Otherwise, that will affect the grant funding that you can select. So once you've started your application, you'll have the overview, and you'll be able to see the terms and conditions of the awards online as well. So when using IFS, when completing your application, you can assign questions to those within your collaboration, within your consortium, sorry. There's also guidance for each question, including what sort of responses we're looking for within your application. You're able to check the word count and also format your answers. So this is the overview of the application, which I'm sure many of you are familiar with. So it's split into 3 sections: the project details, application questions, and your finances. So I'll take you through application details. So here you need to include your timescales, the research category, the innovation area, and whether or not your application is a resubmission or not. Within your project summary, we're looking for you to include information as to why your project, what's innovative about it. Public description, so this is what will be published if your project is successful, so please just be mindful of confidential and sensitive information here. And then scope, so here you need to identify how your proposal fits within the scope of this competition. And all of these, so project summary, description and scope, are not marked. So moving on to the application questions. So as I mentioned, these are our standard questions, which I'm sure many of you are familiar with. And you have the optional appendices for 2, 3, 7, and 8. So question 1 relates to need or challenge. And here we're looking for you to explain what is the drive or the reason behind doing your project. For example, you're addressing market pull, technology push. We're also looking for you to describe any work that you've already done to address this need. And we're also looking for you to identify any wider economic, social, environmental, cultural, or political challenges which are influential within your proposal. Question 2 relates to approach and innovation. So what are you doing in your project and how is this an improvement? We're also looking for you to explain where the focus of your innovation will be. And here you need to address factors such as, do you have the freedom to operate? Are you applying existing technology in new areas, or are you developing new technology in existing areas? And we're also looking for you to describe the nature of the outputs you expect from the project and how these will take you closer to addressing the need, challenge, or opportunity identified. And as I mentioned, you can upload an optional appendix for this question. Question 3 relates to team and resources. So assessors are looking to see that you have the right skills, experience, and access to facilities. So here we're looking for you to detail who's in what role and why you're using them. If you're using any key external parties, such as subcontractors, you need to justify here why and why you can't use any UK-based alternative. Here you also need to address any gaps in the team that need to be filled, and you also have the optional appendix. Question 4 relates to market awareness. So how well do you understand the market that you are or that you will be operating in? We're looking for you to describe the size of the market, structure and dynamics of the market, your current UK positioning, and any barriers to entry that you might face. And for innovative projects where the market may be unexplored, we're looking for you to detail what your route to market could or might be, what the size of the market might be, and how your project will seek to explore the market potential. Question 5 relates to outcomes and route to market. So what is the impact of your project on your business and your consortium? Describe your current position in the market. So are you extending or establishing your market position? How will you profit from your innovation? For example, are you going to have higher revenue or cost reductions? And we're also looking for you to detail the short or long-term impacts that the innovation will have on productivity and growth. For any research activity in the project, here in this question you need to outline your plans to disseminate project research outputs over a reasonable timescale. Question 6 relates to wider impacts. So here we're looking for you to detail what are the wider impacts of your project outside of your immediate project team. You need to identify and quantify the economic benefits of your proposal and identify any expected social impacts, whether these are positive or negative. For example, jobs, are they created, changed or displaced? Any regulation or social inclusion or exclusion as a result of your project? And again, environmental impacts, both positive or negative. Question 7 relates to project management. So assessors are looking to see that you have a well thought out project plan. So you need to outline the main work packages, indicating the relevant research category, the lead partner, and the total cost of each package. We're also looking for you to describe your approach to project management and any project management methodology you might be using. And identify any key links or dependencies between work packages and milestones. And again, you can choose to upload a project plan or a Gantt chart to support this answer. Question 8 is around risks. So here you need to identify any key technical, commercial, managerial and environmental risks and explain how these will be mitigated. And we're also looking for you to list any project outputs on the critical path to completion. And again, you can choose to upload a risk register to support this answer. Question 9 is in regards to additionality. So here we're looking for you to explain the difference that public funding from Innovate UK would make to your project. Describe the likely impact of the project on the business of the partners involved, and explain how the nature of R&D activity would change as a result of this project. And also explain why you cannot wholly fund the project yourself from your own or private resources. What would happen to this project if it was unsuccessful? And finally, question 10 relates to costs and value for money. So here, assessors are looking to see that your project is reasonable and good value for money for you and the taxpayer. You need to explain how partners will finance their contributions, and you need to justify the balance of costs and grant across your consortium. You also need to justify subcontractor costs and why these are critical to the project. I cannot stress enough that you need to justify subcontractor costs within this question, as assessors don't have the full detailed overview of your finances, so please put all crucial information within this question. So I will now hand you over to Joe, who's going to take you through the application finances for this competition.
Thank you, Mel. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Joe Lyford. I'm the portfolio manager for this competition, so I will be managing the competition process from now up until the point that successful projects actually begin doing their work. So I'm here to talk to you about three things today, really. First, I'm going to talk to you about the funding rules for this competition. Secondly, I will talk to you about how to submit an application using the Innovation Funding Service. And finally, I will talk to you about what will happen should you be successful in applying to this competition. So the finance section for industry partners within the Innovation Funding Service is split into three areas, as you can see. And each organisation must complete each of these areas individually before an application can be submitted to us. So these areas are your project costs, your organisation and your funding, and I'll take you through each of these now. So the first area is your project costs, and for those of you who have applied to us previously, you will recognise the eligible cost categories on the screen. You will need to enter the detail within any of these categories that you require to deliver your project, and the service will calculate the total values for you. So I will touch briefly on what is and what is not eligible as we go through each of these cost categories, but full guidance on this will be available to you when you work on your application, so this won't be completely exhaustive today. So the first eligible cost category is labour costs. And here you can enter the details for anyone who is to work directly on your project. The service allows you to enter their project role, their gross annual salary, and the number of days in which they are to spend working directly on the project. And it will then automatically calculate a daily rate and a subsequent total cost for your labour costs. All staff in labour costs must be paid as per PAYE, and you should include non-discretionary items only. Discretionary items, however, such as dividends, bonuses, or any form of performance-related pay are not, however, eligible and cannot be included as part of your labour costs. For overhead costs, you have three options available to you. Firstly, if you do not wish to include any overhead costs at all, then you can simply select this option and it will automatically produce a naught value for you. You can select, alternatively, the 20% of labour costs, which will automatically calculate a value based on your labour cost, obviously. Or thirdly, you can choose to calculate your own overhead costs yourselves. And for this option, it's worth pointing out that the calculate overhead option is split into both indirect and direct overhead costs. So we at Innovate UK class indirect or administration overheads as those costs associated with back office functions such as finance or HR, for example, who will not be working directly on your project, but they will be playing some form of supporting role and should therefore still be included. And these costs must be both additional and directly attributable to the project itself. Secondly, we have direct overhead costs, and these are costs associated with staff working directly on the project, so essentially those that you've included within your labour costs category. And these are items such as laptops and utilities, for example, which again must be directly attributable to the project itself. So the Innovation Funding Service allows you to download and upload the calculation spreadsheet, and to reiterate, full guidance on this is available to you online. Moving on now to material costs. Here you can simply enter the items, volumes, and the unit costs for any materials which are to be used entirely on your project itself, and the subsequent totals will be calculated for you by the service. We would expect any residual values to be removed when entering the cost per item so that costs within this section are entirely specific to the project. For capital usage, you can include a description of any assets that you require to deliver your project, state whether they are new or existing, include the depreciation period to be used on the asset, which should be in line with your organisation's depreciation policy. You can state the value of the asset at the start of the project, the residual value at the end, and finally the degree of utilisation required of that asset to deliver your project. The Innovation Funding Service will then automatically calculate the usage cost for you based on the details that you provide, as you can see in the example on the screen. For subcontract costs, you can include the costs of work which cannot reasonably be carried out in-house. If the work is to be carried out abroad, then please do include an explanation as to why a UK alternative has not been selected. And in addition, if the work is to be carried out by a linked entity, such as a parent company, for example, then please do include a statement that the work will be carried out entirely at cost with no profit element incorporated within the figure that you have stated. For travel and subsistence, you should include the costs of any journeys which are really necessary for the delivery of your project. Please make sure that the purpose is always explained, and note that any sales or marketing activity or any form of exploitation, these are not eligible items, so please do not include them within your travel and subsistence costs. And the final eligible cost category is other costs, which is simply to be used for items which do not fit into the previous cost categories. Examples of these include training costs and patent filing costs. Across all of your cost categories, we do ask that you please ensure there is no double counting across any of the categories, and you can simply describe and justify any such items in the box provided in IFS. So once you are happy that all of your project costs have been added to the system and you've included everything that you need to deliver your project, you will be given a final opportunity to review all of these sections before you actually confirm that you're happy with them. You will also need to confirm that the costs you include are eligible as per the project cost guidance, which you will be able to find online. And then when you're satisfied, you can simply mark this section as complete, and that element of your application will show as complete. Okay, the next area of the finance section is your organisation. Within this section, you need to enter details relating to your organisation specifically, such as its size, for example, which will then determine the level of grant that you are eligible to receive from us. If you are a newly incorporated organisation and you don't have any previous account history, then please enter 0 values for the financial fields, such as in the example that you can see on the screen. And the final area of the finance section for industry partners is your funding. So the level of grant that you can receive from us depends on 2 things, really. Firstly, it depends on the type of organisation that you are, and secondly, it depends on the type of research that your project represents, and IFS will actually calculate your grant based on these 2 criteria. So these are actually the funding rules in place for this competition, and I know Richard touched on these earlier in his presentation. So I think businesses are quite clearly outlined on the slide. For research organisations, universities can claim 100% grant funding, which is obviously 80% of the full economic cost. Other research organisations can claim 100% funding, but they must be non-profit distributing, and they must clearly disseminate their project results. In addition, public sector organisations or charities can also claim 100% grants, but again, they must be performing research, and again, they must clearly disseminate their project results. So this next slide is a worked example of a potential project consortium. And as you can see, in this consortium, we have 3 business partners and 2 research organisations. So as you can see, the research partners have total eligible project costs of 75 grand each. So between them, that is £150,000. And obviously, given that the total project costs for this is £500,000, that is in line with the 30% research proportion of total eligible project costs, which is the rule that we have in place for this competition. So the next slide shows that the maximum level of grant entitled to a potential applicant is 70% based on the details that they have provided into the system. You also need to state here whether you have any other public funding in place for your project, as this will then reduce the level of grant that you are eligible to receive from us. And it's also here that you must state that you agree to our terms and conditions by ticking the relevant box. The terms and conditions were previously outlined in conditional offer letters, which you may have come across in the past. However, we no longer use conditional offer letters for competitions that are run through IFS. So I mentioned before about whether you have any other public sector money in place for your project. So you need to tell us if you have received any other public funding for this project specifically, and you need to declare it. If you have actually received funding for previous work which has led up to this project, then you don't need to declare that. That's fine. But any funding that you have received for this project already from the public purse will need to be taken off your grant funding allowance to comply with state aid rules. Before you actually submit your application to us, you are able to view the financial overview that you have already put in. So this page states the funding rules for the competition, including eligible total project costs and also project duration. Please do check very closely that your figures are in line with the funding rules that are in place for this competition. Can't really stress that enough. And another point to make is that your total project costs must be within the published eligible project costs rather than the funding sought. So please do not confuse the two, because we have seen that previously and we've had to reject applications based on their misinterpretation of the eligibility criteria. If any organisation for whatever reason wishes to participate in a project but not actually claim any grant against their costs, they will need to select the not requesting funding option within the Innovation Funding Service, but still complete the project cost section, as this will still contribute towards the total project costs, and obviously it will still impact on elements such as the level of research proportion that is in place for a project, for example. They will not be named in the grant offer letter, which you will receive should you be successful in this competition, but they will still need to be named in your collaboration agreement, because although there will be no legal relationship between themselves and Innovate UK, there will still be a legal relationship in place between that partner and the rest of the members of the project consortium. Okay, I'll talk very briefly now about the finances for academic partners, which are handled slightly differently and are processed through the GES system. So this system is actually already very familiar with academics and universities. It's owned by the research councils rather than us, and it actually validates the costs for us to produce the 80% full economic cost figure that we then use going forward in your application. Academic partners, if they are to be included, will only need to complete the Your Project Cost section in IFS. This must be completed for them to be included as an official collaborator in your project. So this next slide just shows you which fields will need to be completed for an academic partner, which must also be identical to the with council status PDF GES document that you will also need to upload as part of your application. And as I mentioned, given that the GES system is not owned by us, any queries relating to academic costs are best directed to the GES help desk, whose contact details are provided on the screen. Okay, in terms of actually submitting your application to us, the next slide shows the project cost summary for a project with all of the participants included. This is the level of details that assessors and other members of your consortium will be able to see of your finances. And obviously, because they are quite sensitive, the detail behind these cost items can only be seen by individual organisations, so you will only be able to see your own, so to speak. In terms of actually checking your project costs, the Innovation Funding Service will check that all partners have marked their finances as complete and that the research proportion of project costs is no greater than 30%, as I mentioned to you earlier. It will flag if there are any issues that you need to address before you can actually submit your proposal to us. After this, you will then have the option to review any aspect of your application before you then submit it. And we recommend that you leave plenty of time to finalise your application, as deadlines are absolute. Obviously, there's a midday deadline in place for this competition, and the system physically won't allow any submissions even 10 seconds after this deadline. So please do always give yourself plenty of time in which to submit your application to us. When you're actually ready to submit the application and you're happy that everything is completely fine, simply click on the green icon and you'll be taken to this confirmation page, which will obviously show you that your application has been successfully submitted, and it also outlines the next steps in the competition process. So I appreciate you might not be able to see this next slide too easily, but this table essentially shows, from a previous competition, the number of applicants that submit their proposals each hour leading up to the noon deadline. So as you can see, the majority of applicants leave it right until the final minute to actually submit their application to us, even though at these types of briefings we always tell them not to do that. We strongly recommend, therefore, that you submit your application a little bit earlier than that, if you can, to avoid any last-minute technical issues, because obviously if you try to submit your application 5 minutes before the noon deadline and you have any problems whatsoever, it's very difficult for you to then contact us and for us to get that sorted to you before the deadline itself. So please, once again, give yourselves plenty of time in which to submit your proposal to us. Once you have submitted, you can return to your dashboard page within IFS, which shows you the status of any applications that you have started or indeed submitted to us in previous competitions. Okay, I'll talk very briefly now about the assessment process that we have in place for this competition. There's a lot more detail available to you within the competition page on our website. Okay, this slide isn't supposed to look like this. We'll make sure when we get the slides out to you after today's briefing that this slide is corrected, but I'll talk through it anyway. All applications submitted to us will be assessed by 5 independent assessors from both industrial and academic backgrounds, and we will then collate these to produce a total average score per proposal that we receive. Key things that assessors want from applications include clarity, always clarity with the appropriate amount of information included within your application. So they don't want to be completely bombarded and overloaded with technical detail, but at the same time, they don't want to have to make guesses and assumptions as to what you're trying to say or what you're trying to achieve within your project. So it's about finding the right balance between those two. In addition, make sure that your responses are always justified and, where necessary, quantified. And a viable opportunity for growth must clearly be presented throughout your application, which therefore necessitates an injection of public funding. And once all of the applications have been assessed and scored, feedback will be made available to you within your IFS dashboard, which will explain why you've been given certain scores for certain questions. The project lead will be notified when this is available to view. So obviously, even if you are unsuccessful in applying to this competition, we will still give you some valuable feedback, which hopefully you can use to then go and develop your idea for the future. As part of the assessment process for this competition, as you may have already read, we are running interviews. So after the initial written assessment through IFS, there will also be interviews for those who have scored highly enough. For those of you that aren't familiar with this process, they're a little bit like a Dragon's Den type format interview process. So you can bring up to 9 people to attend an interview from your consortium. You will then have 30 minutes to present your proposal to a panel of 5 assessors. After this, there will then be a Q&A discussion of up to 45 minutes, followed by a potential second 15-minute Q&A discussion. You will have the opportunity to actually provide a response to the assessor's feedback prior to the interview panel. And as well as that, you can submit your presentations, and you will need to submit your presenter names to us in advance of the interview panel. But further detail of this will be made available to you should you be invited to this stage nearer the time. Okay, finally, successful applicants who have gone through the written assessment and the interview panel and have come out of it on the other side successful, you will then go through to the project setup process within the Innovation Funding Service, which looks a little something like this, with all of the required milestones listed. So you as applicants therefore have greater visibility of what you need to complete, and also what we need to complete internally, which should hopefully speed up the process of actually getting your project off the ground. Each of these milestones must show as complete before we can issue you with a grant offer letter, which is then when you can actually go and start your project. So one very important milestone is the return of the signed collaboration agreement, which obviously we're going to require for all projects within this competition. This stipulates the relationship within the consortium, and from my experience of working at Innovate UK, is probably the most common cause for delay in project starting due to complex things such as IP arrangements, for example. So we recommend, well, we ask that you please start working on these as early as possible. And finally, once you've actually started your project, it's important to know that grant is always paid quarterly in arrears, and you can only claim grant against costs which have actually been incurred and defrayed during the project period in question. You therefore need to always be careful with your cash flow and your cost management throughout. And finally, projects will also be subject to quarterly monitoring by an appointed monitoring officer who will introduce themselves to you later down the process should you be successful. Okay, thank you very much for listening, and I think we're going to break for a Q&A session now. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Joe. We're about to have around 20-30 minutes of questions. I know lots of people online have already asked Monica a few of them. We will be having in the panel Simon, Neil, Richard, Melissa, and Joe. So if you have any questions in the room, just raise your hand. Okay. Yeah.
Hi, I just wanted to check where you've got a subcontractor who is being managed by one of your collaborators. Do you still need to justify that subcontractor within your part of the application, or is there a section in their part that gives them space to do that?
Okay, so subcontractors don't actually have any detail that they provide themselves within an application. So whichever, yeah.
The collaborator is dealing with the subcontractor. So at what point do you? Sorry. Yeah. So our collaborator is dealing with the subcontractor. So is there a part in their part of the application where they justify the subcontractor, or do we still have to do that in our part of the application?
So it depends where the costs sit. So if the costs are going to sit within your collaborator, then it will be the collaborator who needs to describe what the work is and obviously justify the subcontractor.
Okay. Thank you. Hi, John Bradburn from Atkins. So in the scope, you say you're looking for 6 to 12-month pilot at scale in a semi-controlled or public environment. I'm just going to ask if you could give some definition around two of those terms. At scale, so what are we looking for there? And semi-controlled.
Thank you.
Who wants to take that? I'll see what I can do with both those questions. And guys, chip in if I rewrite the Oxford Dictionary. So at scale, we really mean large. So have a look at what's happened previously and consider what, compared to those, would actually be quite an ambitious project for delivering some sort of real-world public, real-world passenger self-driving passenger service. You know, I would say the at-scale piece is also important for scale-up following the project as well in terms of commercial viability. So, for example, I think I've used this example a couple of times today, and it's a completely agnostic example. I'm just giving it not as a technical example, but as a scale. But you might have 10 square miles where you might want to say deliver some sort of public self-driving service. Within that, you might want from this competition to say serve about 5 or 6 square miles of that, and the potential for scale up goes on to the full 10 square miles or whatever it might be. So that's kind of what we mean by scale. This is significantly bigger trials than we've had before. So we're reusing that as a so we're using the others really as a benchmark here, the ones that are happening already. And the other one was it semi-controlled? And public. So public is public highways, of course, it's on the road or on pedestrianised areas. So we currently have on and off highway trials. So the Milton Keynes pods are running, of course, on public footways. And then we have a number of on-highway trials as well. Semi-controlled means that the public sometimes, if not always, might have some access to that route. So one example of that, again, just an example, would be like a busway or if you want some sort of beaching line or something like that. It's entirely up to you. It's really the semi-controlled or the public area, we're really asking you to make sure of your safety case, whatever you decide to go for and roll out.
Yeah, just to add a little bit more to that, you could consider that. Sorry, you could consider that a controlled environment is one where there is no other traffic. on a public environment is one where there is complete public road and anything in between. We're not saying it has to be any one of those. That's up to you to decide and to justify. So that's what we mean by semi-controlled. So going on a bus lane would be semi-controlled in that context.
Steve Berry from SciNation. Is cybersecurity a requirement like it has been in previous CCAV calls? And also, if consumer data is being utilized in some fashion, is GDPR a requirement?
Yes, to both.
Yeah. Thank you. First, my colleague Monica has some questions from the online audience.
Some question from the web audience. So David Winder asks, this seems to be a project to test existing CAVs against public acceptance. Should new CAV projects apply anyway?
Sorry, I never quite caught that.
So the question was, is it, he thinks that is, that existing CAVs are tested against public acceptance and not necessarily looking for new CAVs.
Okay, so it depends. I mean, the most important thing here is actually the user case. So what you come up with in terms of what you want to apply CAVs to. And then from that, you work out what service and business model you might want and what technology you can then apply to that. If you decided as a consortium that requires a new CAV that's currently not developed, then you could develop a CAV as long as it's within constraints of the financial parameters to deliver that user case or service. So the short answer is no. There are no restrictions in that sort. You don't have to be an existing CAV capability, if you know what I mean.
And then just following on from David, he's actually working on a software project apparently. Can he, as he's evolving technology, can he use the software that has been used in previous calls and build on it for this existing one?
Well, yeah, yes, in short, as long as any funding he's getting for a new project isn't duplicating what he's doing in an old project and it builds on it rather than duplicates.
Thanks, Simon. Maybe one more from Magdalena. Regarding an academic research partner, does it have to be an academic institution, or can it also be an individual researcher who is employed or who she is employed at an academic institution? So not the university as such, but the person? I don't know.
So it will have to be an organisation that we fund rather than specific individuals. All collaborators have to be an organisation rather than any one individually.
So university of something and a department of something. Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much. I think we had a question. That's a... Yeah, it would be easier. Sorry.
Dale Reid from Control F1. When you were talking about the CAV4 funding, you mentioned that it was for both connected and autonomous vehicles, but then throughout the presentation it mentioned SAE level 4 autonomy. So I just wondered if you could clarify, does it include potential scope for connected vehicle functionality, or is it purely autonomous vehicle functionality?
It's for autonomous vehicles, and those autonomous vehicles may or may not have connectivity. It's not for purely connected vehicles which are not autonomous.
Thank you. Do we have any other questions from? We have one.
So from the audience, once again, from Lee, this competition for funding being spent on the actual CCAV first and foremost, or also for external supporting systems? That's all I have.
Sorry, say that again.
So, this competition, is it aimed for funding being spent on the actual CAV, or also for external supporting systems?
So I imagine the infrastructure side.
Yeah, so there's a requirement in the competition rules about the amount of money that goes to the supporting infrastructure that I think you mentioned, Richard.
Yeah, there is a limit on the supporting infrastructure. I'm not sure that we actually specify what that is.
Yes, I think the best thing is to speak to us offline about that, and we can give you some further guidance.
Yeah, Yeah, obviously we just have very short questions and not the details, but I will tell them. And then last question from the audience, from Chris Moore. How does this competition interface with your Meridian 2 and 3 CAV competition, or are they or is the number 4 additional?
So the Meridian 2 and 3 competitions are obviously separate competitions. If you submit a project which interacts with those existing test beds or potential test beds, then as long as you can see why or articulate why that is a good thing, then that's absolutely fine. We're all about being joined up across our investments. So in short, no, you don't have to work with the Meridian test beds.
Thank you.
Just to add one point to that, and that is to bear in mind the timing of the test beds. So it's quite possible that the test bed 1 competition, the Meridian 1 competition, those facilities may well be available in time for these projects to start, depending on what facilities are required. But for Meridian 2, Meridian 3, it's going to be pushing it a little bit. You might be able to catch the use of those facilities at the end of the project, but it's going to depend on the delivery timing of the facilities. So if there is a dependency on those, check the timings with Meridian, I would suggest.
Thank you. Do we have any other questions from the audience? Okay.
That was a clearer answer than mine. That's what I meant to say.
That's right. Hello, it's Kirsty Lloyd-Dukes from Morpheus Labs. You mentioned in the scope that you needed to prove the trials being proposed were more efficient in terms of time and cost. So is that definitely both time and also cost? Because those two things might be counterproductive, I suppose. And is that cost to the public or cost to the provider?
I mean, essentially, you know, those are two parameters. Yes, they might work against each other, but they both go into your business case, which is justification for the investment and how it's actually commercially viable in the long term. So yeah, it might reduce time, might reduce cost. Sometimes there's a trade-off towards the efficiency of the system as a whole as well when you're taking the wider transport systems. So I'm deliberately not answering your question because I think it's something that you have to answer for us.
Anyone else has to add anything to that? Any other questions? Okay. No? So we're fine. In that case, I would like to thank the panelists. And if you have any other questions for them, I imagine you can just drop them an email, and they will be more than happy to reply. And you can find them after today for a few more minutes, I imagine, outside. In the meantime, we will move on to the